you'd like to open to Genesis chapter 9, we're going to be starting in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 18 this evening. Genesis chapter 9 and verse 18. In Genesis chapter 9 and verse 18, we're looking at what starts off with a group of people who are all, it seems like, on the same page. They have the same goal. They have the same purpose. They have the same thought and intent in mind. And then from there, they kind of separate and then come back together again. But the way that they come back together is problematic. And that might seem strange if you think unity. How could unity be problematic? But in Genesis chapter 9 and 10 and 11, we see that sometimes unity really is the problem. And, you might examples of this if you're thinking that doesn't sound right. We've all seen those congregations, right, that are unified first around the potluck and nothing else, right? That's the core of all that they do, is that potluck meal. And Sarah and I once had difficulties with a congregation where that they did not want to hear God's truth because it would have impacted their ability to have everyone there for the potluck. And so that's a kind of unity that will take you in the wrong direction. And I see your face, Dave, but just trust me, that really happened one time. But no, and you see congregations that are unified around youth group activities, and that's the primary thing that they do, and everything they do is kind of focused on that and that alone. And even sometimes you see congregations that are unified around sin, and that's what happens in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And it says that all the lack of unity they had in Corinth, but they all came together to defend this one man who, in 1 Corinthians 5, it says that he had taken his father's wife, and they were unified around that sin. And so unity certainly is what we're striving for, but not just any unity. And in Genesis chapter 9, 10, and 11, Moses reminds us of the beauty of unity when it is centered around God and around God alone. And so let's notice that. Starting in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 18, he says, "Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan." He's given us a little clue there about what's going to happen. And he says in verse 19 that these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. And so you see in the beginning, the brothers all had really the same goal in mind. And that's the earth had been destroyed, the population had been destroyed, and there's Noah and his wife, and then his three sons and each of their wives, and that's it. There's nobody else on earth. And so they begin the process of filling the earth again, and that is their whole purpose here is to populate the earth. That's what God told them in the garden, to be fruitful and multiply. And he tells them the same thing here as they're getting off of the ark, that their goal is to fill the earth. Now, of course, it's implied by the flood, I think, that they're trying to fill the earth with righteous people. They don't want to do the flood again, and they know they won't do the flood again, but they don't want to have problems like that. And so it's implied that they're filling it with righteous people, and that they're filling people to rule the earth. And that's what God told them in chapter 9 and verses 2 and 3, that he wants them to rule the earth and to be in charge of it. And they're filling it with people who are going to love their neighbor and love God. And really, you see the first little seeds of the Ten Commandments right here in Genesis chapter 9, when he says, back in verses 3, he says, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I've given you all these things, even the green herbs, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is blood. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply. Bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it." And so you kind of see God is set up here, Noah's authority to have government over people, and the indication that if they hate each other and murder each other, that's going to cause problems. And of course, it's pointing back to Cain and the problems that they had there. But that, of course, we know from the New Testament, if they will love your neighbor as yourself, and that's what Paul said, right? In Romans 13, he said, if you love your neighbor as yourself, there won't really be a need for law because everyone will just take care of each other. And so you love yourself, but then he also says in chapter 9, and continuing on, he talks about their relationship together, and he talks about how he has established a covenant with them and every living creature that's with them. And he says that this covenant he'll never flood the earth again. And then he gives them the sign of that covenant to a perpetual generation to set his rainbow in the cloud for the sign of the covenant, that when he brings the cloud, they'll remember what he said, and he will remember what he said, to never destroy it again. And the rainbow shall be in the cloud, and God will look on it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And he said, this is the sign. And so there's within that embedded this idea of trusting God, that he knows what he's doing. And when they see that rainbow, to remember that they can trust him and therefore obey him. They can follow him. And so you have what the Ten Commandments say: take care of each other and trust and love God. You have what Jesus and Paul said, that all the law hangs on these two thoughts: to love your neighbor as yourself and to love God. Well, that's been the way always. And from this, God talks about it even right here. And so the three brothers seem very centered on this idea until the events that start in verse 20 take place. And it says that Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but I want us to remember that before the flood, the land had been cursed. And you remember that after Adam and Eve left the garden, God said he would curse the ground, and it would be difficult to make a living out of it. And so had they been growing things before the flood, certainly they had been growing things. Had they had vineyards and things of that nature, absolutely they tried. But the indication is it would have been very difficult to get very much out of the ground. And I think that's really the point of verse 21, when it says that he drank of the wine and was drunk, and he became uncovered in his tent. And you know, if you read about Noah, you'll read a lot of different things about what's happening here. Some people say this is Noah's rebellion. You know, this is his weakness. He really just likes to drink, and so he gets himself into trouble here, and that's possible. Some people say that you're looking at a kind of PTSD situation where he's watched the whole world die. I mean, I can't imagine how stressful that would be, and how those visions of the flood coming and everyone you know dying, how that would haunt you. And so I think that's possible. But I think that really the point that he's getting at here is that Noah, by himself, it's just him and his three sons, were able to take the land and cultivate it and grow enough grapes to even get drunk off of. And that perhaps there really hadn't been, now I have no doubt that people worked hard to get drunk in the flood. That's before the flood. That's very evident in the way that it's talked about. But perhaps Noah really wasn't that familiar with how much grapes that it would take to get to that point and how long that would take. And that this was really sort of Noah just not really understanding how all that works, because it had been so hard to get just a few grapes out of the ground before. But now, all by himself, he can grow that much. I think what this verse really points to is God kept his promises. He lifted the curse from the ground, and they grew in abundance. And whether or not Noah knew what he was doing, or he was dealing with PTSD, or he was ignorant, we can't say for sure why he took it this far. But what we can say is that him taking it that far created problems for his family. And so it says he got drunk, and he was in his tent, but he wasn't really fully covered. And so verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and his two brothers outside. But Shem and Jacob took a garment and laid it on both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. And so Noah's problems left him exposed and left a temptation for his son, and his son gave into that. And so where his son had been with his brothers, united in this one purpose, now he goes to his brothers with a new purpose, with a new problem, if you will, and he falls into this temptation. His brothers are still committed to doing what's righteous, and so it says that they turned their faces away and they covered their father's shame. But Ham gives into that temptation. And so God has shown his trustworthiness with this obvious plenty, with the lifting of the curse, but we find ourselves in really a Cain and Abel situation all over again. They don't murder each other, but you have brothers against one another. One of them is, and we don't know exactly what it means, that Ham saw his father's nakedness. And there's lots of speculation about what that says. Most of it, I think, is by reading too much into the text. But what we do know is he did more than he should have. And whether that's just looking or something else, he did more than he should have. He didn't have the right attitude about his father in this compromised situation. And so it pits him against his brothers, and you find this division between people who should be united and should be united around building this righteous world that God intended them to build, filled with righteous people. And so the consequences of sin should have kept people faithful beyond Noah's death. I said that backwards, didn't I? The consequences of sin kept people from staying faithful to Noah, or to God, even after Noah's death. And that's Noah curses Ham and Ham's descendants. And then it says Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. And that really is where we see the end of this focus on God until we get to Abram. We go into chapter 10, and we're not going to look at this extensively, but you look at these genealogies, and you have in the first 5 verses, the first verse, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the verses 2 through 5, you have Japheth's line. And notice that it says in here, in verse 5, from these, the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families and to their nations. Now, I ask you, what does that sound like? The coastland peoples were separated into their lands and into their languages. That sounds like what happens after Babel, right? And this chapter 10 is leading up to chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. And so you have this list of people, Japheth, and then his children on down, until you get to verse 5, and it says, from these people, you have this dividing. Well, I think the idea is Japheth's family was there at the Tower of Babel. Practically all the world was. And so you have here Moses highlighting the universal participation of sin. Japheth's family gets caught up in the sins at the Tower of Babel. You keep going and you look at Ham's line in verse 6. The sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim and Put and Canaan. Now, Ham has been cursed by Noah because of what he did, but they actually have the most impressive people in the list. They have the mighty hunter Nimrod, and then the beginning of his kingdom, verse 10, was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh and the land of Shinar. And you go on in verse 11, and they built Nineveh. All of these really big places that for generations into Daniel's time and beyond would be important cities and world rulers. And so you have here Moses highlighting what ultimately are going to be centers of sin. That's what Nineveh became, right? A center of sin that God destroyed not long after Jonah's time. You go on and he talks about the Canaan land, and he talks about, down in verse 19, the borders of the Canaanites was from Sidon, and he goes on to describe that with more detail. Well, what happened to the Canaanites? They became a center of sin, and God destroyed them when the Israelites conquered their land. And so he's going through and he's describing all of these great places, these big cities. He mentions Sodom and Gomorrah in this list of the people who were descended from Ham. Well, we know what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. They were destroyed because they became centers of sin. And so you have Japheth's line, and they were divided at Babel because they were caught up in that sin. You have Ham's line, and they did mighty things by earthly standards, but all these places became centers of sin that ultimately had to be destroyed. And then finally, in verse 21, you get to Shem's line, and especially if you're Jewish, and if you are reading this in Moses' time, you're thinking, oh, here's our people. This is where it gets good, right? You know, these are the good guys, and they have been so far, right? Cain versus Seth. Cain's people die in the flood. Seth's people cry out in righteousness toward God. Shem's line is the good guys. And he tells us some of their names, but notice verse 25. He says, to Eber were born 2 sons. and the name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And so you have division. And what does it mean for the earth to be divided? Some people will tell you it's an earthquake. I think he's talking about Babel. And it's another reference to when everyone was divided up and sent out all over the world. And so he says even Shem, his descendants, get caught up. Moses highlights the worldwide sin that even Shem's line joins in the events that led to the dividing of the world. And so in chapter 11, the accounts of Babel reveals what happens when we unite around sin. And that's his sons were united, they became divided, but then over time their descendants became united again, but in such a way that it caused great problems. Notice chapter 11 and verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. They were civilized people, is what he's saying. They had technology. They were accomplished. They had intellect and could use it to do things. And so verse 4, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city of the tower, which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they began to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. And I always thought that was interesting that God says, he says, they are caught up in something that isn't good, but nothing that they propose to do can stop them. They'll accomplish it. And it really speaks, I think, to the power of unity. If you have a group of people who all really believe the same thing and are of one mind, nothing really can stop that group. And you look at history and you look at these small pockets of moments where, they call it mob mentality, right? Everyone gets stirred up into a frenzy and they all want the same thing, and they overthrow governments and they accomplish big things in a small amount of time, because when people are unified, they really are, in a sense, unstoppable. Isn't that really what we want? Don't we want to be so unified that the things that we try to do, they just work and they come together and they are accomplished? I think that's what any nation would want, what any group of people would want. And God says, in essence, they have it. Now notice why they have it. In verse 1, he says they understand each other. They literally speak the same language, but you can speak the same language as someone and not speak the same language. They really understand each other. They know what they all mean when they say, let's do this. Number 2, it says they walk together, or verse 2 says they walk together. They journeyed together. They were going in the same direction. There was no division. They all wanted to be in the same place together. Verse 3 says that they worked together, that they had a job and a way to lay out that job between them all so that they could get the work done efficiently and get it done well. In verse 4, it says that they all desired things together. In particular, they desired glory. They desired glory together, that they were unified in wanting that. And then in verses 5 and 6, it describes how, here really we see where it begins to break down. And that is that the Lord was not on their side. And that really is the key factor there. They are unified, and they would have succeeded if God had been on their side. But because he wasn't on their side, they couldn't ultimately succeed. But even God says, unless I intervene, they really will do whatever they want to, because a united people is unstoppable other than God's intervention. And so he continues, and he says in verse 7, come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, and that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building that city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. See, they were united, They had this special moment, but they wanted to glorify the wrong person. And I think that's really what it all comes down to for them. Their unity wasn't about God. And so God was willing to destroy that unity because it wasn't centered around something good, around something holy, around something that makes people better, around something that makes people want to do good. And so they certainly were united, but that unity was going to ultimately destroy them because it wasn't centered around the only thing that can really make a person more than just self-seeking. That's at the end of the day what they want. We'll glorify ourselves and build a tower so tall that nobody can ignore us and nobody can tell us what to do. Nobody can take advantage of us. I can serve me. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that in John 17, that's what Jesus prays for. In his last moments on earth almost, he prays for unity. And he wants his people to be one and to be of the same mind, the same thought, the same heart, the same choices. He wants unity, but God destroyed unity back at the Tower of Babel. Unity is clearly very important to God, but not just any unity will do. There's only one kind of unity that God finds valid, and it's the kind of unity that I think is really shown in Acts chapter 2, when essentially I think you have in essence a reversal of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, the world all comes together and everyone is there, and when they split up, God splits them up, they no longer speak the same language. They no longer can communicate well or live in the same place. They don't have that purpose and ability to remain together as one. But in Acts chapter 2, you have people from all over the world coming together in one place. And suddenly people who were speaking diverse languages one moment ago now all hear the apostles speaking to them in their own language so that they're all able to understand each other. And in a sense, they do all speak the same language for that time. And they all live together for a while in Acts chapters 2 through 5. And they all have this oneness that we're told earned them the respect of everyone who was around them because they were all just so focused on this one thing. And so I think you're really looking at sort of a reversal of the Tower of Babel because they were all just so focused on bringing God glory. That was what they wanted there. That's what they did. They focused and served God and God alone. And so in closing, just some very short kind of practical thoughts from this story about the Tower of Babel. How can we be unified in a way that pleases God? That's what Shem, Ham, and Japheth, I think, had at first. They had a unity that pleased God in the beginning. But Ham sort of messed that up. And that's what we tend to do sometimes, I think. We have good intentions, but we get caught up in our own lust and temptations, and we cause divisions and complications within even our own bodies sometimes. And so we want to guard against that. How can we be unified in a way that truly pleases God? Well, from verse 1 of chapter 11, we all speak the same language. Now, I don't mean we all have to speak English necessarily. There are Christians all around the world who speak all kinds of languages. But wherever we are, in whatever language we speak, we all should speak Bible. And that's really the idea of 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10, when he describes how he wants them all, his great desire is that they be of the same mind, to speak the same thing, to have the same understanding, to think about the Bible in the same way, and then to teach others that to think about it that way. And so we all must speak the same language if we're really going to be unified. And any time that we choose to interpret or to think about the Bible in a way that's different than how God intended, we are by nature creating division within our own numbers. And so it's important that we work to have that same understanding. From verse 2, just like they all walk together, we all walk together. I think about 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, when Paul says to imitate him as he also imitates Christ, that he is walking after Jesus, and that we also want to just be walking, following in his footsteps, and modeling ourselves after his life. And that if we are all walking together and following Jesus, we will find that we are having more and more unity. From verse 3, they all worked together to make their bricks, and that's what we want to we work together. And we work together for God's kingdom. I think about Acts chapter 2. Notice Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 4 and verse 32. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 32, it said that the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And that really just means that they were very willing to sell anything so that they could help someone who was in need. And with great power, the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. And that's great power, great grace. The Bible uses the word grace a lot. I can't think of many places where it uses the word great grace. There's something special here. And it's there, he says, because they were of one heart. They were of one soul. The idea of soul is a life. My life is so tied up in your life that when something happens to you, it's like it happens to me. One heart, one soul. And they were working together to spread the great power of the apostles, the witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. This was their work. All that they did was to make sure that people knew that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, so that they had one work together for the kingdom of God. From verse 5 and following, back in Genesis chapter 11, they desired their own glory, but we desire, and we make our greatest desire, and I think that's life's challenge, isn't it? To put God's glory as our greatest desire. It's natural to want our own glory, or to want our own security, or to want our own desires to come first. But the Bible gives us this great blessing and responsibility to make God's glory something that we want more than anything else, for Him to be glorified, for people to speak well of Him and change their lives to be like Him because of what we're doing. And that's what 1 Corinthians 10:31 describes. In 1 Corinthians 10:31, he says, whatever it is that they're doing, whether they're eating or not eating, he says, it's all for the glory of God. That's what we want to make our purpose. You know, businesses talk about mission statements. That's our mission. That's what gets us out of the bed in the morning. That's what we want to strive for anyway, that I get out of bed in the morning, not because I can't wait for my Folgers or my Wheaties, not because I'm so excited about work or whatever it is. I get out of bed in the morning thinking God's glory is something I want to show the world today. And when we have that desire for God's glory, we will be united. And it says, unlike in Babel, where God was against them, if that is how we are, God certainly is on our side. I think about Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 to 22. We actually read this morning also. In Ephesians 2:19, he says, now therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. I always love that. Buildings don't grow, do they? This building does. It grows into the holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. That's all they wanted in Genesis 11. They wanted to build something special. They wanted to build something that could reach the heavens, something that God himself couldn't ignore. Well, he couldn't, could he? They wanted to build something that was magnificent to behold and wonderful and that brought attention and glory. They tried, but their glory wasn't about God and they failed. But what we do here, sometimes it feels insignificant. What we do together, sometimes it feels like nobody cares. What we do here can sometimes feel like another check that we have to, or another box we have to check, or another step on the road, just something that we're doing. But Paul says we are growing a building. Now, how do you grow a building? I'll let God worry about that. But we are growing a magnificent structure that reaches into the heavens. He says it is God's very dwelling place. Well, that's where God lives. He lives in the heavens. And this is growing up into something that the world ultimately will not be able to ignore. And we have a special place in growing that building when we walk with the purpose and intention and unity of God's glory above everything else each and every day. And so I think Moses encourages us. There is nothing more beautiful than being unified around God and around God alone. And if there's some way we can encourage you to do that, if there are prayers that you need or answers, questions that you have about God's glory, about the Bible, about salvation, if there's anything we can do for you, we ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.